revolutionary like I'm Huey Newton. Che Guevara when them bullets start shooting.
Hello comrades and welcome to another episode of Communism for Beginners. And we are still reading Foundations of Leninism, so this time we're on chapter 5, which is the Peasant Question. And slightly longer chapter, quite a lot of stuff, but it doesn't focus that much on theory. I mean, I suppose it kinda does, but it deals with these theoretical questions by talking about history of the history of the Russian Revolution, the 1905 and the 1917 revolutions. So I think it would probably be best to focus on the history a little bit, in case you don't, you might have questions about that, because the Russian revolutions are actually a lot more complicated than you might think. There was actually really many things going on at the same time, and there's a lot of different stages in the revolution. But he begins by saying that he takes 4 aspects of this: the presentation of the question, the peasantry during the bourgeois democratic revolution, the peasantry during the proletarian revolution, and the peasantry after the consolidation of Soviet power. And he begins by saying that some think that the fundamental thing in Leninism is the peasant question, that the point of departure of Leninism is the question of the peasantry, of its role, its relative importance. This is absolutely wrong. The fundamental question of Leninism, its point of departure, is not the peasant question, but the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, of the conditions under which it can be achieved, of the conditions under which it can be consolidated. The peasant question, as the question of the ally of the proletariat in its struggle for power, is a derivative question. The circumstance, however, does not in the least deprive the peasant question of the serious and vital importance it unquestionably has for the proletarian revolution. So, yeah, that is important to realize, because there is this idea which is somewhat widespread, where you occasionally hear people express these kinds of views. They say that Leninism and I guess also Maoism and so on and so forth, that they are like socialism, or that they're Marxism, which somehow makes the peasant question the main thing. There are a number of people who consider themselves Marxists, but they say that socialism in a peasant country is impossible and that the peasantry is really not an ally. But yeah, as Stalin points out, it's the peasant question is an important question, but that's not really what Leninism is all about. It's more complicated than that. Also, he later in the chapter he quotes Engels, who says that the conquest of political power by the Socialist Party has become a matter of the not too distant future. That in order to conquer political power, this party must first go from the towns to the country, must become a power in the countryside. Then Stalin says that he wrote this in the 90s of the last century, having in the mind the Western peasantry. Does it need proof that the Russian communists, after accomplishing an enormous amount of work in this field in the course of the 3 revolutions, have already succeeded in gaining the countryside and influence and backing the like of which our Western comrades dare not even dream of? How can it be denied that these circumstances must decidedly facilitate the organization of economic collaboration between the working class and the peasantry of Russia? He continues, the skeptics maintain that the small peasants are a factor that is incompatible with socialist construction. But listen to what Engels says about the small peasants of the West. So he emphasizes that, in Russia it's even easier, but and in the West it's not as easy, but Engels is even talking about the Western peasants and not the peasantry of Russia, which is already in favor of socialism. But yeah, this is what Engels says. We are decidedly on the side of the small peasant. We shall do everything at all permissible to make his lot more bearable, to facilitate his transition to the cooperative should he decide to do so, and even to make it possible for him to remain on his small holding for a protracted length of time to think the matter over, should he still be unable to bring himself to this decision. We do this not only because we consider the small peasant who does his own work as virtually belonging to us, but also in the direct interest of the party. The greater the number of the peasants whom we can save from being actually hurled down into the proletariat, whom we can win to our side while they are still peasants, the more quickly and easily the social transformation will be accomplished. It will serve us not to wait for this transformation until capitalist production has developed everywhere to its utmost consequences, until the last small handicraftsman and the last small peasants have fallen victim to capitalist large-scale production. So that is pretty interesting. I didn't remember that Engels quote, even though that is from the Peasant Question in France and Germany, which I read just recently, but I guess I must have missed that. Interesting. Yeah, so Engels is pretty much completely negating the Menshevik idea that they should just wait for capitalism to develop further. That he's basically saying that we shouldn't wait for capitalism to develop and ruin all the peasants, that it's, the sooner we can get to socialism the better, that there's no point in just waiting for capitalism to develop and ruin the peasantry and create a working class. I mean, just capture powers as soon as you fucking can. And he also points out that there's incredible human suffering involved with the the development of capitalism, like the Industrial Revolution. But, it's also material damages, and it's just in every possible way, if you just can capture power sooner, then do it. It's not an excuse to not capture power, like saying that, the country is a peasant country, the country is an undeveloped country. That's not an excuse to not capture power, according to Engels. To me, it's interesting that Engels actually so strongly argues in favor of the position that you might, at first, if you heard somebody say that, you would maybe call them a Leninist, but it seems that Engels also strongly argued in favor of that. But yeah, Stalin goes on and he talks about the stages of the revolutions. He says, we should bear in mind the following circumstances which determined the peculiar character of the Russian bourgeois revolution. The unprecedented concentration of Russian industry on the eve of the revolution. It is known, for instance, that in Russia 55% of all the workers were employed in the enterprises, employing over 500 workers each. So, really big factories compared to other countries. He continues, the second characteristic is the hideous forms of exploitation in the factories, coupled with the intolerable police regime of the Tsarist henchmen, a circumstance which transformed every important strike of the workers into an imposing political action that steeled the working class as a force that was revolutionary to the end. So, basically just the fact that, a lot of these things have to do with the fact that the Tsarist regime was so reactionary that it didn't compromise at all, and that was kind of its downfall, in my opinion. The third aspect is the political flabbiness of the Russian bourgeoisie, which after the revolution of 1905 turned into servility to Tsarism and downright counter-revolution. Which, this is another aspect that was interesting in terms of the Russian Revolution, because a lot of the Mensheviks said that, the bourgeoisie led the bourgeois revolution in France, in the Great Revolution of 1789. um, and that therefore, we should just let the bourgeoisie lead the revolution in Russia as well, because it would not be a socialist revolution, because it would be a bourgeois democratic revolution, an anti-feudal, anti-monarchy revolution, which, at first it was. There was the failed bourgeois revolution of 1905, and then the successful bourgeois revolution of February 1917. But the Bolshevik position was that no, the working class should actually lead the revolution, because even though it was a bourgeois revolution, the workers were the only ones that would be able to carry it through, because the bourgeoisie would eventually become reactionary, and which, that's also what happened in France actually. So the bourgeoisie would they would just have the minimal advances that they wanted, and then immediately after that they would become reactionary. They didn't actually want democracy or anything. So therefore the peasantry and the working class should lead the revolution, and as he points out, the bourgeoisie wasn't actually even that revolutionary. The main revolutionary mass in favor of the democratic revolution was the peasants, the petty bourgeoisie. But the argument was that the proletariat should still lead the revolution, because they were the only class that was truly revolutionary and truly wanted to carry it through to the end. The argument was that in France, in the Great Revolution, the proletariat didn't have a party, didn't have its own party. It wasn't an independent political force at all. It wasn't a clearly defined class at all. It was very, very politically weak. And the Bolsheviks argued that in Russia, on the other hand, the proletariat is very strong and very independent and very revolutionary, and has its own party, whereas the bourgeoisie is actually relatively weak and very, very reactionary compared to in the situation in France. Then the fourth aspect of the bourgeois revolution in Russia was the existence in the countryside of the most hideous and most intolerable survivals of serfdom, coupled with the unlimited power of the landlord, a circumstance which threw the peasantry into the embrace of the revolution. That's another important point. Then the fifth one is Tsarism, which stifled everything that was alive and whose tyranny aggravated the oppression of the capitalist and landlord, a circumstance which united the struggle of the workers and peasants into a single torrent of revolution. Then the last one is the Imperialist War, which fused all these contradictions into the political life of Russia into a profound revolutionary crisis, and which lent the revolution tremendous striking force. So there was all that going for the revolution. The oppression in the countryside was just, crazy. There was absolutely no democracy of any kind. The oppression and the exploitation in the cities was also just incredible, and the police terror, and then there was the war as well. So life was pretty unbearable. So it kind of just, to me, that was the real thing that just caused the revolution to happen, because the regime, they didn't compromise at all. They didn't allow any kind of democratic anything substantial, and there was no land reform, nothing of any real value, and also the war, that they just allowed the war to continue, and everybody hated the war, and it was horrible. And of course Russia was also losing the war, and that caused the Tsarist regime to fall. But the real thing, like usually you would expect that, okay, now they get limited democracy, they get land reform, therefore, socialism is not so likely to happen because the population won't be so radicalized. Which is, kind of what happened in Finland, for example, although that happened right after the socialist revolution failed. The capitalists decided, and the nobles decided, okay, let's give them a land reform, let's give them some democracy. Although the democracy was actually taken away, but there was land reform. So they compromised a little bit to kind of make the peasants at least not want a revolution as much, because they got land, so they didn't really care anymore that much. But in Russia, when the Tsarist regime fell, then even the provisional government, which is what took power in February 1917, even the provisional government, they didn't give land to the peasants. They didn't stop the war, and they started actually taking away all the democratic rights as well. They set up like a, what was it called, like a pre-parliament, and the provisional government became more and more reactionary, and it wasn't very good to begin with. But at first there was some hope, but then it became very reactionary very quickly. So it didn't give land yet, and it didn't stop the war, and it did nothing to fix the economy. And Lenin, in his pamphlet called The Impending Catastrophe and How to Combat It, and the impending catastrophe was, what he felt were the consequences of the situation in 1917, like the war and the economic ruin of the war and the situation. And he basically in that pamphlet he laid out some ideas like that the state should take stronger control of the economy to stop the capitalists from just ruining the economy, and stop the landlords from hoarding, and because there was famine and in the war and all that. The provisional government didn't do any of that, so in my opinion they were really just that was their big mistake, that they didn't do any of those things. But anyway, so he continues and says that this period extends from the February Revolution of 1917 to the October Revolution of 1917. This period is comparatively short, 8 months in all, but from the point of view of the political enlightenment and revolutionary training of the masses, these 8 months can safely be put on par with the whole decades of ordinary constitutional development. Because there was, of course, the population. At first, they didn't the Bolsheviks didn't have that much popularity at first, of course. But they quickly began gaining a lot of popularity precisely because of what the provisional government was doing and wasn't doing, because the provisional government failed to deliver. So he goes on and says that this characteristic feature of this period was the further revolutionization of the peasantry, its disillusionment with the socialist revolutionaries, who were they were a socialist party, kind of like a peasant, petty bourgeois party. The peasantry's desertion of the socialist revolutionaries, its new turn toward a direct rally around the proletariat as the only consistently revolutionary force capable of leading the country to peace. Because most of the soldiers were peasants, because most of the country was peasants. So the peasants really wanted peace, as well as land. The history of this period is the history of the struggle between the socialist revolutionaries, petty bourgeois democracy, and the Bolsheviks, proletarian democracy, for the peasantry, to win over the majority of the peasantry. The outcome of this struggle was decided by the coalition period, the Kerensky period, the refusal of the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks to confiscate the landlord's land, the fight of the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks to continue the war, the June offensive at the front, the introduction of capital punishment for soldiers, the Kornilov revolt. So Kerensky was he was a socialist revolutionary. It wasn't like, not as in an actual socialist or an actual revolutionary, but he was. Those people were called the socialist revolutionaries. That was what they called themselves. So, and the Kerensky was the leader of the provisional government, and the Kornilov affair or Kornilov revolt was it was a coup, basically a failed coup that Kornilov wanted to become like he was a general that wanted to become like a military dictator, but it was later found out that it wasn't actually a coup against the Kerensky government. It was actually planned together with the Kerensky government, and they had actually decided that Kornilov and Kerensky and some other people would actually set up like a collective dictatorship, like a dictatorship of a small clique, and that they would it was basically like a very much a like if you know what happened in the French Revolution, it was very close to the Napoleonic counter-revolution, military dictatorship. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much what I have to say about this. If you haven't read the chapter, then I recommend you do so. He talks about the theoretical aspects a bit more, but he mostly deals with the history, and the history of the Bolshevik and the the Russian Revolution in general. It is kind of complicated. There were a lot of things going on, because there was first the February Revolution, and then there was the things leading up to the July days, which in July there was kind of an armed rising. The population, the proletariat which supported the Bolsheviks largely, they started to take up arms and rise against the government, and the Bolsheviks said that the revolution shouldn't happen yet, that they weren't ready yet, but the population did it anyway, and then there was a massive counter-revolution. The Bolsheviks were just crushed, and Lenin had to flee the country, and then he came back, and then there was all that stuff. It's pretty complicated, actually. But yeah, that's it for this episode, and I will talk to you guys later, and if there's any questions, feel free to ask me. Okay, bye bye.